Hello everyone, this video is about peasants' revolt as well of a struggle for the throne between Henry Bolingbroke and Richard II. Stay tuned. Before the start, as usual, many thanks to my patron Holy Father, as well as to Vincent Nards. He is amazing voice-over actor for this video, so let's start.
The introduction of another poll tax in England in the year of our Lord 1381 caused great discontent among its population. The last time this tax was levied in 1377, when its amount was in proportion to class and wealth. The tariff rate had been equal to 1 groat or 4 pence. This time, however, the tax had tripled, equal to 1 shilling, and levied as a fixed amount independent of income. After Edward III's death, taxes were levied on numerous occasions. There were almost no English possessions left in France. The sea became more turbulent, and in spite of severely diminished populations caused by the Black Death and subsequent plague outbreaks, many nobles insisted on the introduction of manorial rights and obligations, which were inappropriate and unfair towards the lower classes. When it's time to collect these taxes, people everywhere tried to evade them and resort to deception. The peasantry hid their wives and children, or simply went into the woods to avoid meeting the collectors, or plainly refused to pay. In May, a tax collector in Essex was attacked, and when the magistrate arrived to investigate the incident, he in turn was also attacked. By the end of the month, riots had broken out all over Essex, and early in June, the uprising spread to Kent. We cannot say that there had not been any uprisings prior to these events, but any outbursts of discontent had usually remained local. This time it spread like a wildfire in earnest, the most serious attack on royal authority in England during the entire 14th century. The rebels, as per usual, accused the King's Council of being the evil culprit of their misery. Under the slogan, "For King Richard and the community," they demanded the heads of the nobles they thought to be traitors and had fought for their misery. The English army was still in France, or deployed on the Scottish border, which was most convenient timing to instigate an uprising of the common people. Exacerbating the situation, the Crown was very slow to react to the events. Historians named these events the Peasant Revolution, which seems inappropriate examining the situation in detail. Although many of those who took part in the violence were indeed peasants, the rebels included many tenant farmers, small landowners, local officials, attorneys at law, estate managers, bailiffs, constables, and demobilized archers. The fact that the various groups of rioters seem to have communicated with each other effectively while maintaining strict discipline meant that there were many among them who were educated and experienced in leadership. As unrest and riots increasingly spread, the king, his family, and royal council took refuge in the Tower of London. One of those who took refuge with the king's party was the king's cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt. At this point, the future usurper was the same age as King Richard II. Richard was persuaded to engage in diplomacy with the rioting faction. The uprising had already spread to the outskirts of London, but the city gates had been barred. On June 13th, the king left the tower and set out on a barge down the River Thames to Rotherhithe. He addressed the rioters from aboard the ship, since the king's advisors had considered it too dangerous to go ashore. The rebels' demands included the heads of John of Gaunt and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Chief Justice and Treasurer. The king replied in a diplomatic fashion, they say, will receive the heads of those they want, but only in accordance with the law. After this statement, the barge returned to the tower. The rebels were running out of provisions and were hoping to be able to resupply their party in London. Heading south along the river, they plundered the Archbishop's palace at Lambeth and freed prisoners from Southwark Prison. Then, against the orders of Lord Mayor Walworth, someone lowered the drawbridge and opened the city's gates. The rioters surged inside, clearly in an organized fashion, sacked John of Gaunt's Palace of Savoy, and destroyed the Temple Lawyers' Quarter, released prisoners from Fleet and Newgate prisons, and then began to massacre foreigners, mainly those of Flemish origin unlucky enough to get in their way. The king was reduced to watching the clouds of smoke rising above the city from atop his window in the Tower of London. By this time, having learned the name of the leader of the uprising, Wat Tyler. Tyler is assumed to have hailed from either Essex or Kent. He may have had estates in Maidstone or Colchester. It is assumed that he was a roofer, but could also have been a minor noble of Kentish origin. The king agreed to meet with the rebels again on June 14th at the Mile End. The rebels brought forth new demands in addition to the previous ones. The heads of their proclaimed enemies were not enough. They formulated a series of political measures to be taken. The abolition of serfdom, a fixed rent, 4 pence per acre of land, equality of all people in hierarchies beneath the monarch, abolition of the titles of nobility such as lords and knights, and amnesty to all who took part in the uprising. The king declared that he would satisfy all the requirements and return to the Tower, where he discovered that during his absence, another group of rioters broke into the city, dragged out the Lord Chancellor, the Archbishop of Sudbury, and the Lord Treasurer, Sir Robert Hales, and beheaded both of them on Tower Hill. Henry Bolingbroke could consider himself lucky, having been able to escape a similar fate. Whether the killers acted on behalf of Tyler's orders, and whether he was even present at Mile End, remains unknown. Most of the rioters dispersed, went home, pleased at the acknowledgement of their demands by the king, but the most persistent and stubborn, including Tyler, remained. The king agreed to meet them the next day at Smithfield. On Sunday, June 15th, the king left the Tower, accompanied by 200 horsemen, the Lord Mayor and some courtiers. At Smithfield, the king and his entourage gathered at one end of the field, with the rebels opposing them at the other. Tyler had to speak to the king and rode across the field on horseback. The objective truth of the following events is unclear, since various chroniclers describe a different sequence of events. Some describe Tyler as having dismounted, others state he remained mounted. He may have taken the younger king's hand and called him brother. Others claim he did not afford the king his due honor by taking off his hat. It is possible that he added another demand to those of the previous day, the reform of the church and the abolition of the outlaw status. He might also have demanded a jug of wine to wet his throat. Others allege he pulled out a dagger and threatened the Lord Mayor. Another possibility is someone from the king's retinue started insulting Tyler, calling him a thief and a swindler. It is also possible that someone from the very start of the negotiations had an intention to arrest or kill Tyler, a scheme to which the king may or may not have been privy. The only fact that is undisputed, however, is that Tyler was stabbed to death, probably by Lord Mayor Walworth. Tyler fell to the ground. Some of his men, former archers, saw their leader fall and drew their bows. The young king showed amazing courage, facing this unexpected chain of events. Whereas it should be considered that it may not have occurred to him, spoiled child that he was, that he may have been in mortal danger, his inexperience and ignorance shielding him from any fear he may have felt in this moment. Richard galloped towards the rioters, drew his sword, offered for them to look upon him as their captain, and ordered them to follow him to Clerkenwell, where he would give them whatever they asked for. The rioters, complying and probably demoralized by the killing of their leader, departed for Clerkenwell, while the king and his escort went their own way. As for Lord Mayor Walworth, it is possible that he galloped into the city and rallied all the soldiers, knights and townspeople able to wield a weapon of any kind. According to Walsingham, their numbers amounted to about 1,000 men, but it is possible that several hundred went to Clerkenwell, where they may have been surrounded by the rebels. The rioters were either forced to abandon their weapons or simply persuaded to go home, while some knights from the royal retinue apparently escorted them to the city gates. The veracity of a report of the dying Tyler being brought to Tyburn and hanged in the presence of the Lord Mayor remains questionable at best. The Kingdom of France experienced similar rebellions at the same time, caused by an excessive tax burden on the populace. Immediate, swift, and ruthless suppression of the uprising by Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, prevented French royal authority from a similar humiliation compared to the fate of the English aristocracy. No matter how great both countries' desire to continue the war may have been, apart from minor naval skirmishes, no significant military operations took place, while the threat of a French invasion of the English mainland seemed like a realistic scenario to the Plantagenet aristocracy, whereas in reality, bad weather and the rather unrealistic estimation of the actual military power of France probably prevented such an undertaking from becoming actually feasible. The English army saw the continuation of hostilities as their only option to earn fame, titles, and money, since the royal treasury had been burdened to an extent where they could barely expect any payment from the crown. But transport of goods such as wool, wine, could only be undertaken using armed convoys, which further worsened the situation for English garrisons in France. All the soldiers were reduced to, at this point, was extortion of the local populace or an occasional ransom for captured noblemen. As Richard grew older, he increasingly detested his advisors and council, since their influence and control over the realm had grown substantially as well. His uncle, the Earl of Gloucester, as well as the Earl of Arundel, pleaded with the king to intervene, demanding the resignation of Michael de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, who in their minds was responsible for a disastrous foreign policy. They accused the Earl of failing to prevent the loss of control over Flanders, while simultaneously losing the support of the Duke of Brittany. Richard's response seems to have been formulated in an irritable mood, stating that he would do no such thing, using a kitchen metaphor, telling them that he would not dismiss as much as a scallion from his kitchen. The Earl of Gloucester, in return, saw fit to remind the king that in similar past circumstances, monarchs could be deprived of their throne, as had happened with Richard's grandfather, Edward II. At this perceived insolence, Richard is reported to have lost his temper, openly being threatened with rebellion and usurpation, furiously replying to his vassals that in a scenario such as this, he would see no other option but to turn to his brother, the King of France, for help. Richard, however, did not carry out the threat and dismissed the council. Regardless, Richard's habit of appointing favorites to lucrative posts and his reluctance to continue the conflict with France almost led to a civil war. The ensuing crisis saw armed forces led by the Earl of Gloucester and Arundel, opposed by soldiers loyal to the king, paid out of his own pocket. The Lords Appellants, as the opposition now called themselves, won the only battle during this crisis near Radcot Bridge in December 1387, whereas the following year the so-called Ruthless Parliament denounced 5 of the king's favourites and sentenced them to the gallows and quartering as traitors. No matter how much they deserved it, legally, such a decision was considered little more but murder, which caused the king to devise a scheme to avenge his favourites at a later point in time. The following year, 1389, Richard announced that from now on he would rule legally in his own name, since he had turned 22 years old. He prudently decided not to change any of the advisors of the Lords Appellant had forced upon him. The state treasury was empty, but time had come to pay off the crown's debts. While still suffering from frequent raiding on the Scottish border, Richard desperately wanted to end the war with France. He needed peace, a desire that was shared by the King of France. In 1389, a temporary truce was agreed upon, but negotiations soon ensued in an attempt to turn it into permanent peace between both kingdoms. England relinquished Cherbourg and Brest to the French, which caused discontent among the Lords Appellant. Regardless, the peace still lasted for several years. During this period, Richard attempted to turn his court into one just as flamboyant and luxurious as any other in Europe, while slowly starting to recruit soldiers, mainly from Cheshire. These troops displayed the emblem of Richard II on their livery, the white deer badge, rather than that of the red English cross of St. George. In 1396, Richard was married for a second time. His late wife, Anna of Bohemia, whom he had married in 1382, had died in 1394. His new wife, Isabella, daughter of King Charles VI of France, was just 9 years old at the time. During the ceremony in Calais, Richard made a vow that caused an uproar throughout all of English society. He promised to assist the French, to depose Pope Urban, and recognized Pope Clement of Avignon as the only legitimate heir to the keys of St. Peter. The English clergy, as well as the laity, thinking the king had abandoned them, were outraged and decided that the king was playing into the hands of the French cause. Richard remained calm in the face of the ensuing calamity. A bride's dowry of £170,000 was enough to recruit even more soldiers and start his plot to avenge the deaths of his friends and favorites who had been executed 9 years prior. In July 1397, he ordered the arrest of Gloucester, Arundel, and Warwick, with Chief Lords Appellant. Gloucester was transported to Calais and executed quietly, possibly strangled. After all, Richard possessed royal authority and could proceed as he pleased. Arundel, Warwick, and their supporters were tortured in front of Parliament. Richard tried to mirror the events of the earlier ruthless Parliament, chaired by John of Gaunt. In September, Arundel was executed and Warwick sentenced to life in prison. Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, had at one time been a member of the Lords Appellant. Although he had been pardoned, Bolingbroke was seen as a potential threat and therefore was sent into exile for 10 years. Opposition grew as Richard's rule turned into tyranny, with utter disregard for the laws and traditions of the kingdom. The tax burden on the populace was increased, since the lavish and luxurious lifestyle of Richard's court required funds. The king declared that he ruled by the grace of God, introducing the title of Majesty for his subjects to address his person, which had not been used by any prior English monarch up until that point. John of Gaunt never once expressed displeasure with the fate of his brother Gloucester, did not oppose the exile of his son, at least not publicly. As far as we can tell, he remained a loyal supporter of the crown. However, what he told his son in private and what advice he had given him before departing for exile remains unknown. In 1398, Richard finally achieved what he had set out to do in terms of foreign policy. He successfully negotiated a truce between England and France, which was to last for 28 years. However, following the death of John of Gaunt in 1399, the king went too far. He turned the 10 years of exile sentence of Henry Bolingbroke into a lifelong banishment. In addition, he confiscated the Duchy of Lancaster, with all its castles, lands, and titles. For the English nobility, this proved to be the tipping point. If the king could do this with the Lancastrian estates, then whose domain would be next? Ignorant or not, unaware of the reaction of his subjects, Richard went to Ireland, as trouble was brewing on its unfortunate island. Henry Bolingbroke seized this opportunity to make his move. He had spent most of his exile in Paris, gaining the trust of the French nobility, who were becoming ever more eager to help and support him. Taking with him only 50 personal guards, infantry, and comrades, who made up his retinue in exile in June 1399, he boarded a ship in Boulogne, and announcing that he was to depart on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, he landed at the mouth of the Humber by the end of the month. The knights and nobles of Yorkshire supported Henry and joined him with their armed forces. Henry, it seems, then had no intention of removing Richard. He only wanted to return to reclaim Lancaster and remove all the evil advisors of the king. When the Earl of Northumberland and his son Henry Percy, known as Hotspur, went over to join his side with their own retinues, Henry gained confidence in the support of the North. After the defeat of Edmund, Earl of York, uncle of the king and regent in Richard's absence, while on campaign in Ireland, and after the surrender of Chester and its garrison without a fight, Richard's spies realized that the situation was dire. In Ireland, the king hesitated, and even when the ships came for him and his army, Richard changed his mind and did not sit in the port from which he was going to leave for his homeland, and as a result had wasted and lost a lot of time unloading and again sailing to another city. Richard landed in Wales when his soldiers slowly started deserting him. With several of his trusted advisors, Richard took refuge at Conwy Castle. The Earl of Northumberland met with Richard as Henry's emissary. The king was persuaded to surrender, after which he was escorted to London, placed in the Tower. Now Henry not only wanted to get what he considered was his by right, but also made up his mind to attempt to seize the crown. Knowing just how willful, unruly, and undisciplined Richard could be, he decided not to leave him in power since he would certainly take revenge if given the chance. He had to think about how to take the throne so that everything appeared within the means of legality. The precedent for the removal of Edward II was dubious, since Edward had been replaced by a legitimate heir. The next in line of succession after Richard was not Henry, but another cousin, 8-year-old Edmund Mortimer, 5th Earl of March, whose mother Philippa was the daughter of Lionel of Antwerp, the second son of Edward III, whereas Henry was only the third-born son of Edward. The English claims to the French throne were based upon an inheritance claim on the maternal side, based upon which Edmund's claim could not be denied. The judges advised against Henry's usurpation by force of arms, since by doing so, he would have signaled illegitimacy to any other would-be usurpers. On September 29, 1399, Richard's 22 years of reign had come to an end. He was persuaded to transfer the crown to Henry, although the legal basis for this was questionable at best. Parliament approved the decision, and on October 13th, Henry Bolingbroke was crowned Henry IV of England, beginning his rule as Richard was sent to the Pontefract fortress. In December, a conspiracy to bring Richard back to the throne was uncovered. In Gloucester, a crowd tore apart one of the main conspirators, the Earl of Salisbury, whereas another Lord Despencer was killed in Bristol, while in Essex, the Earl of Huntingdon was captured and beheaded. Richard was the main claimant to the throne for those who opposed the new Lancastrian regime, and therefore, as was the case with Edward II, his death would have suited the reigning king. The sooner the better. One chronicler suggests that Richard was killed and dismembered, while others insist that the jailers starved the king to death. There were also those who claimed that Richard had killed himself, or perhaps even died of grief. His corpse was transported from the Pontefract to London, and along the way the procession stopped to show his body to the public. The logical conclusion of this report is that the theory of the king being chopped to pieces can be discarded entirely. While grief as cause of death seems unlikely, starvation may have taken a very long time. Thus it can be assumed that Richard II was killed in a mundane, unceremonious way, such as being strangled. Since Henry IV had an interest in Richard's death, it is very likely that he ordered it himself. While the death of Richard II, a period of hesitation and weak rule, had ended, while this episode of the late 14th century had prevented the resumption of any campaigning in France, Henry IV, young, healthy, energetic, and popular, was the one who could have revived the ambitions, but events took a different turn, and the flames of English conquest were to be fanned by another generation.
Well, I hope you liked this video. Like it if you do, subscribe if you don't want to miss more. Guys, if you want to support me, please do consider to support me on Patreon or buy some books from the comments below. With enough money to support, I would able to make videos more frequently. Thank you in advance. Bye bye.